Thank you all so much for coming. I'm really honored to be here with you this evening. Over the last 4 years, I have been the president of a group called Uncomfortable Learning. And the purpose of Uncomfortable Learning is to invite speakers to campus who have views that are outside of the mainstream, views that are provocative, views that are controversial, and views that will challenge students to engage with difficult and complicated issues in hope that doing so may better prepare them to go out into the world and make a difference in whatever issue areas compel them the most. In doing that work, it wasn't always easy. Not only were the issues controversial themselves, but I was a student on a very small liberal arts campus. Williams has 2,300 students, and that meant that everything you do in the Williams community is keenly felt. It's very personal, and everything is more intimate. You see the same people every day, you know everyone by name. And so if you're bringing a speaker who is speaking about race or feminism or class, and they're saying things that reflect insensitivity, or if they're saying things that are inflammatory, it can be very difficult for students in that community to deal with, and it can feel as though they're even kind of encroaching in your space. And so in doing that work, I thought a lot about how did I become wired to lead a group like Uncomfortable Learning. I am African American, I'm from a disadvantaged background, and it would make a lot of sense if I arrived at Williams and thought to myself, I would never want to hear from someone like Charles Murray, who says that on average, there are differences in IQ and intelligence between whites and blacks. I would never want to hear from someone like Christina Hoff Sommers, who says that feminism has gone too far now that it's trying to break the gender binary and include Black women and Latino women. It would make sense if that were my view. And so in writing this book, I had to really think about how did I get to this point? There are a number of influences and a number of factors, but I want to talk briefly about 3 people: my mother, my grandfather, and my grandmother. My mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was 10 years old, and she didn't find out until then that the actual precipitating event took place when she was 12, when her father died of an aneurysm. And she became a little more reclusive. She ran away from home a few times. She was less focused in school. Her relationships with people were more tenuous and more difficult, and she really withdrew. And since that time, her interactions with people have changed, and she's had to deal with mood swings and paranoid delusions. And as a young child, that was very difficult because anyone naturally wants to have a close relationship with their mom. That's, if not the most fundamental relationship you have, certainly one of them. And so dealing with my mom's anger, dealing with her sadness, sometimes she would be very happy, and we would have these days where all she wanted to do was have fun and just go to Chuck E. Cheese, go to an arcade, watch movies, eat ice cream, go out to dinner. It was constantly fluctuating. And I loved those fun days. But many days were more difficult. And so I had to ask myself, what's going on in her brain? Why is she acting the way she is? Trying to rationalize and make sense of this. And one thing that it really did was it forced me to kind of step outside of myself. Sometimes I was very upset. Sometimes I even felt as though I resented my mom for the way she treated me, for things that she said about me, about my dad, that I felt were very cruel. And it wasn't until I got older that I began to really realize, in some sense, she was doing the best she could. But as a kid, I can just clearly recall day after day, constantly trying to make the effort to be closer, to have a more ideal relationship with her. And there was so little that I could do about it. But I think it played a big role in helping me see the value in trying to understand other people and trying to connect with other people and trying to get a sense of how they perceive things and understand things, what motivates them, what gives them joy. And so throughout my life, my mother played a very critical role in my education as well. her mom, my grandmother, was a teacher in Detroit public schools for over 36 years. And when I was 3 years old, she taught me how to read. And I love reading now. But at 3 years old, I wasn't a big fan. And so she had to incentivize this process. So what she would say is, okay, Zachary, you'll sit in my lap, we'll work on reading for an hour. She would have me take 3 fingers and kind of go over the words. She was very good at doing this. She was an excellent teacher. And she would say, if you do this with me for an hour every day, I will take you to the mall, you can play in the jungle gym, I'll buy you something, you can see it, we'll see a movie, take you to the park, we'll have a lot of fun. So she incentivized it pretty well. And we did this for 3 weeks to a month. And I can remember the long drives from her house to the mall that we'd go to, and she would tell me about trips and places she traveled to. Her and my grandfather traveled a lot. And she talked a lot about how when engaging with different cultures, it was important that you resist certain assumptions and that you try to go into new places and new environments with an open mind. And she was explaining all of this in a way that a 3 or 4-year-old could understand. And so that stuck with me as well. And the emphasis that my grandmother placed on reading, explaining to me that knowledge was something I had control over. Financial circumstances as a child is not something you have control over. You don't pick who your parents are. You don't pick the community in which you're born, the community in which you live. But one thing I did have control over was the knowledge that I could gain. And so that really instilled in me at a very early age this desire, this hunger to build a deeper understanding of humanity, to gain a deeper understanding of the world, and to try to see it in its fuller complexity. Another major figure who played a role for me was my grandfather. When I started going to a private school in 4th grade, he explained a lot about the backgrounds that many of my peers had. They were from more affluent backgrounds. The school I went to was predominantly white. And my first day, it was kind of like culture shock. It was like, whoa, I knew that Grosse Pointe was a very affluent suburb, but I didn't know this is quite what their lives were like. And there were a number of assumptions that were made upon my peers first meeting me. One would be that, my main interest was in rap music. Or another would be that, I was there to be the star basketball player. And so encountering these things on a day-to-day basis, I would just ask my grandfather sometimes, like, why is this happening? Where does trying to get a sense of what were the conversations they were having at the dinner table that led to that sort of understanding. And he explained to me that privilege is very complicated. It's often something that those who have it really are not even really aware of it and how it can affect certain preconceived notions that people have. He explained the idea of investing, which was something that many of my peers' parents did, but my parents didn't do. And so as I continued going through private schools and furthered my education, I thought back often on many of the lessons my grandfather taught me and the general idea that my grandmother and my mom instilled about trying to not just connect with people, but find common ground with people and to really get a sense of what motivates people, because I've come to believe that if you can find out what motivates people and what gives them joy, then you are better able to make a difference in their lives. So fast forwarding a little bit, when I got to Williams, having had this great private school education from 4th grade on up, I was very eager to engage with the life of the mind. I wanted to read more than I ever had. I wanted to learn a lot about various political, social, and economic issues. And I was excited to be in a place where I thought I could develop a close relationship with my professors, because Williams was small. And the main priority of most teachers there is teaching. And I was able to do some of that. But one thing that was very clear to me, was very difficult from the beginning, was having conversations across ideological divides. I noticed very early on that most of the professors I had in my classes tended to agree with me on most things. They thought that it was the government's role to provide greater opportunity for those who don't have it. They supported and believed in affirmative action and the ethos of it. And they believed that the difference between America's ideals and institutions was something that we had to focus on. Yet I wanted to kind of push further. I wanted to hear from peers who had different perspectives. And in this intellectual environment, while there were some conservative students and some conservative professors, I noticed that those who were in the minority when it came to not race or gender, but in terms of their political viewpoints, typically conservative students did not feel as though they could speak openly and express themselves in class. And being that I was someone who was very interested in having tough conversations, they would approach me afterwards and say, you know, I really wanted to ask you about this, or I really wanted to comment on this thing that the professor said. And so I started thinking about ways that I could foster this kind of dialogue, ways in which I could bring people together across various ideological stripes in order to gain a deeper understanding of issues that we all really care about. There was a group called Uncomfortable Learning, and this is my freshman fall. A Harvard law professor named Randall Kennedy comes to talk about his book. And while he's there talking, I'd done a lot of preparation. I asked a few questions in the Q&A, and then the president of Uncomfortable Learning comes up and says, Zach, we think you should join the club. And from that point forward, it was like the perfect fit. My involvement increased. I continued to think about ways in which I could make waves within the Williams community, ways in which I could connect with more students and bring more people on board. Overall, I was not able to achieve the change on a broader scale within the Williams community that I sought to achieve. But what I did find is that I was able to make the greatest difference, I believe, in the individual interactions that I had with people who did not really support the work that I was doing, who found it difficult to engage with uncomfortable learning. What I found was that if I approached people with the intent first to listen and simply try to understand why they disagreed, what their qualms were, what their grievances were, what their concerns were, instead of just trying to persuade, I was actually able to make a little bit of headway. They were then more open to saying, you know what, Zach, maybe I'll come to one of these talks, or maybe we can have another conversation. And so one of the main takeaways from Uncomfortable Learning is that while bringing speakers can be important, and while fostering conversations within a community can be very important, I also think it is tremendously important and very valuable to simply try to talk to people whom you know have different backgrounds, whom you know have different vantage points and different perspectives on issues that matter to us very deeply. I think if we all try to do that, our world might be in a bit of a better place. Thank you.
Good, that was lovely, thank you. The conversation surrounding your book so far is largely about the importance of engaging in uncomfortable conversations with people with whom we don't necessarily see eye to eye, right? Sort of leaving our echo chambers. But the majority of the book really is about your childhood and your family. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about it in person. I wonder if, you talk about sort of your hunger for these uncomfortable conversations and dialogue with people who haven't looked through the same lens that you have. But you also have to have an affinity for it. I mean, you also have to be good at it, right? And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your childhood, which was at times tumultuous, your mom's, dealing with schizoaffective disorder, at times trying to turn you against your dad who lived in a different state. Did those experiences also make you good at having those conversations with people who don't necessarily see eye to eye with you?
It did. It made it one thing. I had to confront my own emotions, how I felt about my mom, how I felt about our relationship, how I felt about the ways in which our relationship affected my relationship with other family members. Another really important thing was that my mom didn't only place a lot of value in my education in terms of me going to a good school. She also wanted me to develop certain skills and habits that she thought would help me succeed in the world. And so when I started going to Grosse Pointe Academy, which was the first private school I started attending in 4th grade, my mom wanted me to get involved immediately in something called forensics, which was a public speaking student group on campus. And what you would do is you would read and practice speeches written by political leaders and orators, and then you would compete in competitions. And my mom worked with me on this as intensively as I've ever worked on anything. And at the time, I'm in 4th, 5th grade, and I'm thinking to myself, why do we have to do this? And she was very strict about it. If I got something wrong, she would get upset, very upset. But it did help me develop communication skills. And so that was a part of it as well. That kind of practice, really that kind of like training from a young age. I mean, we would practice, do this for 2 hours. Another aspect was that whenever my mom was angry, she would yell, and she would yell very loudly. And all I could do was sit there and take it. That was the only option. And if I broke eye contact, if I looked as if I was not paying attention, that would only make her more upset. And so I had to learn to listen, to pay attention, when really I felt like crying. And so I think that really was a big part of kind of developing the ability, when something is very sensitive and very personal, to hold it together and kind of calm yourself down and just focus on what the other person is saying.
Yeah, wow. You write a lot about spending most of your life really surrounded by people who viewed the world through a different lens than you, either at school or also in the neighborhoods where you grew up. Do you think that that's not a very common experience, I guess, for most of us? I mean, statistically, right, we're likely to go to school with people who look like us, who have roughly the same amount of money as us. When we become adults, we tend to hang around with people who think like us, look like us, worship like us, love like us.
Right.
Do we sort of lose that muscle, that empathy muscle, that ability to walk in someone else's shoes, try to see their point of view, when we sort of don't spend time with people who aren't like us?
I think we do. I think it's in some sense, it's kind of a human thing to want to be around people who are like you, to want to be around people who share the same values, the same principles, the same ways of life. And I think that's good. I think solidarity is important. Being close with your family is important. Having friends who you do agree with, who see things and share the same values and perspectives based on those values is important. I just think it's also important to make sure that the only people you're engaged with, or that you're not only engaged with people with whom you agree, because it then becomes easier to become a bit more narrow-minded, a bit less open. I think one of the things for me was that because of my mother's mental illness, I was constantly moving. I went to 1st grade at 3 different schools. Every time I made friends, I was like, I'm finally fitting in here. Things are going well. I've got to get up and move again. And it just happened over and over and over. And we're moving from Detroit to some part of Maryland, back to Detroit to some part of Virginia, back to Detroit, because at some points my mom wanted to be closer to her family, closer to her mom. At other points, she didn't feel very close to her mom, and they weren't really getting along, so she didn't want to be in Detroit anymore. And so constantly having to reacclimate myself, having to adapt, that was a big part of how I think I became wired in such a way that I was able to do this kind of work.
Sure. Before you went to Williams, but after you graduated high school, you spent a summer at Stanford.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that and what that sort of sparked in you.
It was like a magical place in many ways. Perfect weather all the time, which is always a plus. I loved my time at Stanford, and what was especially significant was that I was only there for 3 months, yet I developed some of the most meaningful, some of the most important friendships that I have made in my lifetime. And I'm not sure if it's because of the kind of students the program attracted, but I can remember one friend in particular whom I met and I'd hung out with for 2 weeks, and we were just hanging out, having a good time outside of classes, and we had not yet had a political conversation. And some issue came up and we started talking about it, and I could tell he saw things very differently. So I was like, okay, I think he's pretty conservative. So then it actually comes to my attention, someone says, yeah, Mo is very conservative. And it ended up leading to a debate that we had. And we had this energetic, passionate debate that lasted for about at least an hour and a half. And it was, I think the most beautiful thing about it was that we had this intense debate in which it was clear that we vehemently disagreed. And right afterwards, we were still just hanging out. And could just talk about other things. Like it had, never happened, and then do it again 2 days later. And it was such a unique experience. I really have never experienced that anywhere else. And so I think it was very formative.
That's fantastic. And you said people would gather around and watch.
Yes, so for the first one, there were at least 40 people, just kind of, because one person would walk up and say, oh, it looks like they're having an intense conversation. Then they sit down and they watch, and then another person, kind of like a peanut gallery.
Yeah. So then you're at Williams, and you get introduced to uncomfortable learning.
Yep.
And that's really when you started to advocate for a more diverse dialogue, not just on campus, but in op-eds. You spoke in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yes.
What do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure,
maybe?
yeah,
That's
sure,
fascinating.
Yeah. So when I started doing the work with Uncomfortable Learning, I was thinking about what were the ways in which I could spread my message to really get it out there to reach a broader audience. How could I push for conversations and potentially inspire people to consider creating something like Uncomfortable Learning on their campus, or to consider the value of it, at least? How could I describe my own experience in such a way that other people might find that they relate to it? And I thought one way of doing that would be to write. I'd always loved writing. And so I made it a goal of mine to try to write for a few national outlets about issues of viewpoint diversity, political diversity on college campuses. And I ended up writing for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and a number of other outlets. And that then led to me being invited to speak at certain conferences, where I got to meet a number of First Amendment scholars and a number of psychologists who are doing very interesting work around issues of safe spaces and how students are engaging with very difficult issues and the psychology behind it. And then attending these conferences and some of my writing is what led to me testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee last summer. And so when I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, it felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's this issue that I'm passionate about, that I've worked really hard to advocate for, and now I have an opportunity to speak directly to those who have the influence and the power to really make a difference. And so I testified. I gave a 5-minute testimony and then answered a number of questions. And it was an opportunity unlike any that I've really ever had. And I think from there, that's what led to the TED Talk, actually.
Mm-hmm. What sort of feedback have you gotten, both from your writing and from some of your speaking engagements? What do you hear from people?
There is a range. There are a number of people who support what I'm doing, who, Zach, continue, this is really important. I've experienced the same thing at my small school here or my larger university there. But the most vocal have been those who fiercely oppose every aspect of this idea of uncomfortable learning. And the form that opposition has taken has been comments and remarks, personal attacks on social media. There was this platform called Yik Yak that was around for during my sophomore year. And what this allowed you to do is basically tweet anonymously. You could just say whatever you wanted, and everyone could see it, everyone who had the app, and you don't have to identify yourself in any way. And so when I would invite these speakers, the kinds of things that people were saying on Yik Yak, beyond the pale doesn't even get to it. They were everything from you're a traitor to your race, you're an Uncle Tom, to you're a white supremacist. And I asked myself, they must not have seen me, but that was one of them. And then longer responses, and this must reflect something about the way in which you were raised, or your family must have this or that issue. And so all kinds of assumptions were made, and I understood the anger. I understood that it was very difficult, and I tried to think about ways, and I did some of this in my writing, to explain that it wasn't just easy for me to bring Charles Murray to campus and sit down and talk to him.
What do you think we're so scared of if we offer a platform to, or go listen to someone whose ideas we hate? What are we afraid will happen?
I think there are a few things. One is that it's the idea that if Williams College, if a reputable institution of higher education, is going to give a platform to someone who is propagating, promoting views that are found to be deeply offensive, that reflect or explain certain inequities and injustices in society, then you are giving those views more power. And thus you are doing harm. That's one. The second thing is that there may be someone in the audience when the speaker comes to campus who hasn't really thought much about this issue, but hears that speaker and is then persuaded by what they have to say. And therefore you are spreading views that are very, not just hurtful, but views that reflect biases that contribute to some of the injustices in our society. Another concern is that it is personally traumatizing. It's personally very difficult for people who have experienced racism in many forms in their life to engage with someone who is going to say things that are incendiary, that are inflammatory, and that are very hurtful.
And how do you answer those concerns?
Well, one, I had to first just try to understand them, and it really does make a lot of sense. I think all three of those concerns are very reasonable, and I actually don't disagree with any of them. What I would say in response is that I think that there's a potential for the benefits to outweigh the costs. I would also say that it has never been my belief that every member of any community would want to engage in that kind of uncomfortable learning. It was my hope that my advocacy would encourage more people to engage or to give it a chance. It was my hope that in defending free speech and political tolerance, I would be able to foster more dialogue and broaden the range of dialogue. But it was never my expectation that every member of the Williams community would come to hear Charles Murray speak and leave saying, that was fantastic. I really learned a lot. And so one thing I started doing was in one-on-one conversations with student activists, I would say, what do you think I can do such that this might be something that you can engage with or give a shot? And with time and making the effort to be tactful about doing it, I was able to glean some things. One was framing was very important, how I framed the event, not just making it clear that I'm inviting a speaker whom I don't see eye to eye with, but also saying, conveying that I understand the grievances that minorities face in our community, that I understand how difficult it is for people to engage with this, and that it is my hope that all of us will be better prepared to go out into the world and be active citizens and contribute to society and to address these issues and really confront them head on.
Mm-hmm. I saw you in the lobby approached by, I think, a fellow Williams alum,
Yes.
right? And she mentioned that when she was in college in the late 80s, Phyllis Schlafly came to campus. They had a number of conservative speakers. Yeah. I'm a little bit asking you to get in a time machine here, but do you have a sense of what happened, of why campuses became places where you really aren't finding conservative or at least ultra-conservative voices, and you're seeing cancellations like you? So do you have a sense of what led to that?
I do.
Change?
I have a rough theory. One factor I think is social media. I think social media really plays a role in mobilizing bias around things, in galvanizing protest, getting people worked up over something, because you see a video of something you don't like, and it gets retweeted, reshared, comment. And so instead of it being something that people are talking about face to face, where you have human contact, it's just these messages being sent over an interface. I think that's one factor. Another factor, I think, is logically, it was in some sense the next step, which is to say that it was the view of many progressives in the 70s and the 80s that one goal for higher education, for American institutions in general, was to increase diversity, to make them more racially diverse. In doing that, we've now achieved some of that. There is greater diversity. The next step then is to make sure that those students from disadvantaged backgrounds, that racial minorities, feel included and feel welcome. That was the next step. Mm-hmm. Not just have them there, not just have Zach at Williams, but make sure that I feel welcome at Williams, that I feel included at Williams, that I feel as I'm part of the community and that I belong. That is where I think the clash comes mm-hmm. between efforts to promote inclusion and efforts to promote expression. Mm-hmm. If I say that I do not feel welcome when a speaker like Charles Murray is brought to campus, that's where the issue arises. Mm-hmm. If I say that makes me feel as though I'm not able to get the most out of my education, I feel as though it's detracting, it's distracting, and it's very hurtful and painful personally, then it becomes something where the administration says, okay, well, what do we do here?
Yeah. How can schools do a better job of meeting both of those goals, of making sure that students who aren't in the majority feel welcome and feel safe, but also making sure that they provide a diversity of viewpoints?
I think one thing is messaging. There were countless emails I received while I was a student at Williams from the administration in which there was something or another said that leaned toward discouraging students from having difficult conversations, from trying to have difficult conversations, that would encourage people to kind of retreat into their own silos. And so I think if the administration makes an effort in their messaging in those all-school emails to say, it's very important for us to have difficult conversations across ideological lines, and then take the step of having town halls, right? If you have a town hall, this can be tougher at a big school, but maybe you can do it within dorms or do it within student groups. You have a town hall and you come together and you say, how is it that we can improve our dialogue around these issues that we care about? How is it that we can come together across different lines? And you see what people say. Inevitably, some people are going to be resistant to it or not going to favor it, but I think that's one way to start having those conversations. And then another thing I would say is, with respect to educators, making it clear that students should say what they think in class, that no student should feel as though they have to conceal what it is that they really think or feel or believe with respect to an issue being discussed, simply because they're afraid that their professor will grade them differently or view them differently, or that they'll be personally attacked by other students.
Is there anywhere that you draw a line on who should be given a platform? For example, if someone's ideas aren't just controversial but based in untruths, should Alex Jones have been invited on Megyn Kelly's show, even though he peddles, the conspiracy theory that Sandy Hook was a hoax, for example?
So I'm a believer in the First Amendment. I think people have the right to say what they think, but I'm not just going to invite anyone to campus. I have to think that the ideas, that there are serious arguments that have social currency, which is to say this is something that's being discussed in the news and the media. It's something that's on people's minds. I'll give you an example that doesn't fit within that criteria: Holocaust denial. There are people out there who identify as Holocaust deniers, and they're free to say what they think. But I don't see any intellectual value in inviting them to campus because it's an undisputed fact, right? And so that's not something that's being discussed. That's something we know as a matter of history, as a matter of record.
Yeah. So you've recently been hired at The Atlantic. Two questions. What do you hope to do there? What do you want that job to look like for you?
So I hope to do some writing with respect to, I really want to look at education, disparities and achievement gaps, and explore, do some interesting interviews, talk to people at a local and municipal level, talk to teachers, talk to students, and get a sense of what they think should change. How can we improve education in public schools? What can be the role for charter schools? How can we address these achievement gaps and begin improving education and access and opportunity early on?
And then post-Atlantic.
Post-Atlantic.
What do you want? What do you see your long-term goal?
So I would like to go to law school. Harvard Law has been the dream. I would like to focus on a few areas of law: family law for personal reasons, civil rights law out of interest, and then constitutional law as it relates to my interest in the First Amendment and viewpoint diversity. And then I would like to enter public service. So after law school, practice as a lawyer for a bit, and then I would like to run for elected office.
Which elected office?
So ultimately, I'd like to run for president of the United States.
You heard it here first. Has your family read the book?
They have, yes.
Has that led to some uncomfortable conversations?
It has. Yeah, it has. I've done it in small bits, small bits and pieces. But yes, they've read it. It was very difficult for my mom in reading it. We've had conversations about it. Some of them were very tense. Sometimes we'd talk about it, and then it would be difficult to talk again for a while. But they're reading it, and I do have some support.
Good. It's really brave to tell your story in any platform. I just really applaud you for doing that, and for using it to encourage us to talk more and see people's humanity, even if we don't agree with them on everything. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much.